we're standing in the nave of the conventual church of the Knights of St. John. Today it is better known as the Co-Cathedral of Malta. It was constructed in 1577 and it was used as a conventual church for as long as the Knights were in Malta. That was for some 260 years. When the church was finished, it didn't look at all as you see it today, with all the beautiful gold carvings, the marble monuments and the tombstones. It was a simple, plain interior, mainly with the lovely colour of the Maltese stone. But for a church to be able to function, it needed certain furniture which was instrumental for the liturgy. One of those items were the graduals, choral books, because in those days most of the Mass was actually sung. So the graduals were the music books that were used by the choir to be able for the liturgy of the Mass to take place and for the Mass to be celebrated in the correct manner. In those days, the Grand Masters, it stated in the statute that they had to give a gift to St. John's Church within the first 5 years of their reign. And the reigning Grand Master at that time, Grand Master Liladam, ordered a set of illuminated graduals to be used for the conventual church. But it was not really for this church that they were commissioned. They were commissioned for the first church that they were using in Burgoo across the harbour. Just to say something about Liladam. Liladam was a Frenchman. He came from one of the most important nobles from France, and he was well connected with French art. So these manuscripts, it is no surprise that they were ordered from a French scriptorium in France. Besides, they were also renowned for their beautiful and delicate gold engravings and illuminations. Liladam is known as a warrior, a tenacious man, a learned and also chivalrous person. He had lost the island of Rhodes, which had previously been the headquarters of the Knights in 1522. But not because he was not a capable warrior, it's just that the Spanish Armada landed on him with surprise with 400 galleys. And obviously the order was overwhelmed. But Liladam negotiated to allow the order to leave rather than to allow the Ottomans to completely extinguish it. For 7 years, they roamed the seas without a home. Until 1530, the island was given to the order by Emperor Charles V. So the Grand Master, Liladam, was known for bringing the order to Malta. So these graduals that were made in France reached Malta in 1533, and the Grand Master died only the year later. So it is not known if the Grand Master actually had the opportunity to see this beautiful gift that he gave the church. Now, also with these choral books, one needed a lectern and also needed a choir stall. And these were the first 3 pieces of furnishings that came into St. John's. And this was around 1598, so that the Mass could be celebrated in the right manner as expected during that time. The manuscripts are considerably large because they had to be seen and read from a distance. And that makes them rather heavy as well, because they are made from parchment. It is said that in each gradual there is a whole flock of sheep. Parchment lends itself very well to preserving color, because the colors are the pigment is easily absorbed into the leather, and like that the brightness and the eloquent colors of the pigment themselves are preserved for a much longer time. An interesting aspect of the illuminations of these graduals is that they are embellished with wild flowers and exotic animals, some of them rather grotesque, because it is bridging the phase between the Mannerist and the Baroque, which is based very much on the Mannerist style. So we find that these types of embellishments had a very important symbolic meaning, and these makes them even more intriguing to study.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for logging into this lecture. I start by thanking the Three Palaces Festival for having asked me to talk about my favorite subject, books. And in particular, these books, which are marvelous and massive. Well, I'm really delighted to give this presentation here in the choir stalls of St. John's Co-Cathedral, the very place where these books were sung from for at least 400 years. And I thank the Co-Cathedral Foundation for making this possible for all of us to film here. And it's always a thrill at being at St. John's Co-Cathedral, and in particular in being on the altar, the very place where people are not normally allowed to be. So for the first 45 years of the settlement of the Order of St. John in Malta in 1530, the order made use of the parish church of St. Lawrence in Birgo, and not this church we know today here in Valletta. The church here, the conventual church of St. John, was consecrated in 1578. And it is hard to even imagine what the church was like in 1578. It was devoid of all the decoration we see today. Preti's vault was not there. It was only painted in the latter half of the 17th century, when he also introduced new windows to be able to illuminate his paintings. And there was none of the marble pavement we see today, and none of the gilded stonework in the chapels. So all this came at a much later date. The church was practically empty. There was also very little natural light in the windows in the vaults. And the nimble light from candles and oil lamps were the only way in which choristers could read the manuscripts. But the lectern and the choir stalls, which you see here, were completed in 1578, the very year when the church was consecrated. The lectern has a square base, a large square base, which is in the form of a cupboard. This cupboard was intended for the storage of the choral books. And in fact, it can take a maximum of 4 choir books. As for the choir stalls themselves, these were reserved for the members of the chapter and the conventual chaplains. And the stalls contain 52 pews and are made of an upper and lower tier, in which the diaconi and cantori would sit down during the sung mass. It is interesting how the importance of having the choir stalls and lectern come before other decorative elements in the church shows that the practice of singing had been well established within the order and was considered of liturgical priority. In fact, the tradition of teaching canto fermo or plain chant to the diaconi and cantori was agreed upon as early as 1459 in the chapter general that the order had in Rhodes. So it goes to show how much the importance of singing and the importance of Gregorian chant for the order when they opened and consecrated this new church here in Valletta. Because Lil-Adam was the Grand Master to commission this collection, we can see his coat of arms appearing in most of the full-page miniatures. The manuscripts are a collection of 10 graduals, which means they contain the text and music for the sung Mass for special feast days, such as Easter and Christmas. Other feast days include Pentecost and Trinity Sunday and the Ascension and other important feast days, liturgical feast days. They are not to be confused with antiphonals, which contain the music of the sung divine office. All the music in these manuscripts is in Gregorian chants, which means it is unaccompanied music. It is just for voice. This is also known as plain chant or canto fermo. But just think for a moment, these manuscripts are almost 1 meter high. Each contains about 100 parchment folios, and they are all decorated with miniatures. As each folio is made from the skin of one animal, a huge number of calves was required to produce them. It is quite extraordinary to think that the 10 volumes together would amount to 1,000 individual skins, all of which required uniform preparation as well as an affluent patron to purchase them. The manufacture of such a collection almost certainly involved teamwork by several different kinds of craftsmen, including scribes and illuminators, decorators and bookbinders, as well as parchment, leather and woodworkers. So this is without doubt an expensive commission involving many people. The manuscripts are dated 1533. And here you can see the date, which is found in one of the miniatures. It also includes the motto of the order, For the Faith, which is written in 3 languages, Pour la foi, Pro fide, and Voor den Globe, in French, Latin, and Flemish. The manuscripts are bound in leather over wooden boards. Each volume weighs about 30 kilos. Handling them during research meant having to ask someone to help me each time I wanted to look at the cover or turn them around or to move them about from the museum to the room where I was working. I started studying these manuscripts in 2004, and each time I look at them, I always am in awe with their beauty. They are absolutely extraordinary. I recently carried out a study on the flowers and fruits that are painted in these miniatures. There are at least 15 types of flowers, with the rose being the most common. They have fine brushwork, the use of color is delicate, and the application of pigment and gold is of superior quality. These are some of the fruits and flowers found in the borders of the initials: pears, grapes, red currants, cherries and strawberries, most of which are berries that would grow in northern climates in the 16th century. Artists were therefore painting what they saw around them. There are also several fantastic beasts, griffins and dragons, several of which are found intertwined or forming mirror images of one another. Some appear like sea monsters or as mythological creatures, half human and half beast. Although there is uniformity throughout the manuscripts, there is also diversity, suggesting the intervention of different hands. For example, here are 4 different representations of the Virgin Mary. From left to right, in the Nativity and Visitation scenes, she is more youthful with her hair tied back or with long wavy hair. While in the scenes of the Presentation and Pentecost, the Virgin appears to be older and her head is veiled. The same can be said of the depiction of Christ. He always wears a grey tunic, except after his death, when he is wearing red, after the resurrection. There are a number of variations with regards to his facial features. Sometimes he has a double-pointed beard or rounded lips, sometimes shorter hair or pronounced pink cheeks. Christ is also represented with blue eyes, which you see on the far right, which in the history of art is considered to be quite unusual. The Lille-Adam manuscripts are a little bit like an archaeological site. The first intervention was carried out in 1582, merely 50 years after the manuscripts were produced. With the Council of Trent, there were changes in the liturgy of the Mass, so entire folios were pulled out and new text and music inserted that followed the revised publication of the Roman Missal. On the right, you can see how pieces of paper were glued onto the parchment folios to cover up the old music and text. And to the left, you can see entire runs of music and of notation that were erased. What's even more intriguing is that in some cases, entire folios were cut and sold to bookbinders who turned these folios into parchment covers for other manuscripts. This one here is from the notarial archives here in Valletta, which was bound and used as a cover for notarial contracts. There are several of these kinds of manuscripts in different collections here in Malta. The newly inserted parts of the Mass after the Council of Trent also included a new set of decorations, this time in a totally different style to the French miniatures. These are Italian and were probably carried out by a Dominican friar who was also active and painted the illuminations in the manuscripts in Mdina Cathedral. Yet another intervention was carried out in the 18th century, when entire folios were covered with paper covering the old music and text. The new chants included antiphons to the archangels Gabriel and Raphael that have nothing to do with the text below. Here you can see how a curious individual had tried to peel away the paper to try to reveal the illuminations beneath. So how was this done? Well, 4 pieces of paper were glued to each other onto the parchment folio. On both sides, on recto and verso of each folio, and new text and music written upon them. And this slide shows 2 fully decorated folios which are covered up in paper. And these images were taken using transmitted light, which show the illuminations beneath, and you can see the text of the 18th century above. Unfortunately, they are like this till this very day. One of the major problems is that the moisture that was used to glue the paper to the parchment has led to severe undulations and cockling that in turn have led to distortion and loss. Another more serious problem is that the ink used in the 18th century has been corroding for a long time. Here you can see loss both in the paper and the parchment substrate, and in some cases the illuminations beneath that show through are also corroding. Fascinating in a sense to look at, but very alarming in terms of the extent of degradation and loss. Since the papers were added on both sides of each folio, there has been a 300% increase in the thickness of the volume. So now the leather joints are breaking and the fastenings are unable to reach one another. These manuscripts are a little bit like an archaeological site, as I said before. So in the 1950s, Don Mauro Iguanes restored these manuscripts. Don Mauro was the librarian of the National Library in Valletta. And he restored 3 out of 4 volumes that were covered in paper. Sadly, entire folios were cropped, altering the size of the volumes, and in some cases the text and notation were outlined in black marker pen. Illuminations became smudged from the chemicals that were used, and the fine quality of the 16th century manuscripts was lost from extensive restoration work. These were the 1950s, and I'm sure Don Mauro carried out these treatments in bona fide. However, the manuscripts have lost much of their historicity. We move on to the way the manuscripts were produced. Parchment has a hair side and a flesh side. We're talking about animals here, calves or sheep. So there's the hair side and the flesh side. As you can see here, the flesh side is whiter and greasy, and the hair side is yellower and velvety. What's interesting are the details of the hair follicles under magnification. Once the skins were ready for use, the first thing that had to be done was organize the page layout. Even if an exemplar was available for copying, the size of each manuscript was never exactly the same. So this meant arranging the manuscript to scale in proportion to its size. Here you can see what are known as bounding lines, which create the margins of the folio. To create the margins and lines for writing, for the music and for the notation, pricking marks were done on the edges of folios that were joined uniformly from side to side. This prevented ruling from being distorted and from skins going to waste. From a study on the marks that were used for pricking, I could determine that at least 5 different tools were used within the same manuscript. What is even more meaningful is that this suggests that most likely more than one scribe was working on the same manuscript at the same time. Of course, this suggests a scriptorium that was quite large to produce such a massive collection. This image here is quite interesting. It shows that staff lines were carried out using what is known as a rostrum or a rake. Essentially, a rake made of 4 pens is attached to a rod. The pens are dipped in ink and used together to speed up ruling. We know that the rake ruling was used here because the parallel staff lines quiver in unison, probably through an object that got caught under the folio, causing the rake to move during ruling. Once the page is laid out, the next step was the writing of the music and the text. The black ink used in the Lilla Dam manuscripts is iron gall ink, and this is prepared by mixing gall nuts with ferrous sulfate and gum arabic. This was prepared on a daily basis and was prepared in different ratios depending on the availability of materials. In order for the ink to be able to dry quickly, dry sand was sprinkled over the freshly written text. In some cases, the so-called drying sand is still attached to the paper or parchment substrate. In the case of the choir books here, sand is found on the 18th century paper, and this would normally have been brushed off in the case of in the normal circumstances. But in this particular situation, we see that the gum arabic, which was used as a binding agent, must have been too tacky, so the sand remained attached till this very day. The decoration is perhaps the most time-consuming in the production of any manuscript. The Lilla Dam graduals are laid out in a typical hierarchical fashion. This means that the opening of every important Mass, such as Pentecost Sunday, which you see here, starts with a fully decorated folio, which also includes a historiated initial. A historiated initial includes a biblical scene or a scene related to a specific feast. In this case, we see the historiated initial with the initial S, Spiritus Domini. Decorations often acted as a visual aid to pick up musical sections within the text, which the choristers often already knew from memory. Much of the decoration was, of course, also done to embellish the books. There are a total of 1,600 decorations in the 10 graduals. The sections within the Mass are introduced via 2 types of initials, those that are illuminated with gold and those that are illuminated with a mixture of gold leaf and shell gold. Coloured penwork initials that are composed of grotesque portraits, known as cadelles, also form part of the decorative scheme. These cadelles are really quite beautiful and also quite cheeky. often found with frowning faces, glaring eyes and crooked noses. The smallest of all the decorations are those that embellish the verses within the Kyrie. They alternate in red and blue and are decorated with white highlights. We move on to the melismatic notation within these choir books. The arrangement of the notation and script had to be well thought out and coordinated before beginning to write, particularly with melismatic notation, which included entire runs with many notes. What is a melisma? Well, a melisma is a passage with many notes that is sung to a single syllable. This is often found in the chants of the Alleluia. So when copying from an exemplar, the scribe could have found different formats and difficulties in column width and page layout, making the placement and length of the melismata more difficult to predict. However, there seems to have been a way out of this. And how did this happen? Well, in the bounding lines of the Lila-Dam graduals, there are a series of scribal cues in the form of numbers that relate to the melismatic syllables in the music. These numbers, which I have termed melisma numbers, are written in small cursive script on the same line as the text. Here you can see number 7, written in Latin numerals. Now this number corresponds with precision to the number of notes used for this melisma. It is clear that the numbers were inserted as a working aid for the scribe, who was responsible for writing the musical notation. And here you can see melisma numbers written in a cursive hand. You have on the right, number 24, written in Latin numerals, and on the left, number 12, written in Arabic numerals. A clear example of this melismatic notation is seen here, where the numbers are written in order starting from the upper staff line onto the lower staff line with 5, 25, 0, 6, 5 and 13. If one were to count the numbers of notes from where the text ends, one could see that the number in the bounding lines is the same as the number of remaining notes. We'll move on to the stylistic influences of these manuscripts. Given the different styles in these 10 manuscripts, there is no doubt that there were several hands involved in their production, suggesting therefore different collaborators. It is not possible to ascribe the manuscripts to one particular artist. 4 main styles emerge, 3 of which are associated with Jean Pichot and his workshop. The 4th is Italianate. One of the Pichot styles is also associated with the master of Claude de France. By way of comparison, here are a couple of examples that show parallels with Jean Pichot's known works and the Lila-Dam manuscripts. This is a detail of a border from a Jean Pichot manuscript at the Bibliothèque Mazarine in Paris. To the left are 2 borders from the Lila-Dam manuscripts. Both display sharp outlines and a candelabrum arrangement, showing arabesques and scrollwork. Both are painted in gold on a blue dotted background and are both very Renaissance in style. And this shows the work of the master of Claude de France in a manuscript at the Morgan Library in New York. There is much of the same delicate brushwork, particularly in the facial complexions. The type of gold highlights are worked with accuracy on a small scale and may also be compared. Just a short note about Jean Pichot. He was active in Paris, where he had a large commercial enterprise, producing both sacred and secular texts. He is associated with Rouen in connection with Cardinal Georges d'Amboise, who was one of his earliest patrons. Now, this is perhaps the part which is most important because it connects us to Malta. Georges d'Amboise was the brother of Grand Master Emery d'Amboise, who became Grand Master in 1503 when the order was still at Rhodes. At the time, l'Isle-Adam was Captain General of the galleys. The two, who had certainly known each other, were both French. It is therefore not surprising that l'Isle-Adam commissioned his manuscripts from an atelier connected with Rouen, when eventually he became Grand Master in 1524. What is important to keep in mind is that Pichot had died by the time Grand Master l'Isle-Adam had commissioned this collection. So the style in our manuscript is definitely of Pichot's collaborators and not his very own. Among many of his works, Jean Pichot was also responsible for producing 6 choir books in 1520, 2 of which are now lost. The remaining 4 are in California, Baltimore, Berlin, and Massachusetts. All 4 manuscripts are extremely similar in quality, size, technique, and refinement. And here are some remarkable comparisons with the Harvard choir book. The figures of Christ in a pointed beard wearing a grey tunic with gold highlights, and the similarity in the depiction of the fruits and flowers and the overall colour schemes reflect an influence between the Harvard choir book and the Maltese collection. And here we can see the colours, which are extremely similar, particularly the reds, the rendition of the Virgin's dress, the lacy collar, the wispy hair, the gold highlights on the drapery folds, and the soft facial features which are strikingly similar. Now, as a book and paper conservator, I cannot but mention the condition of these manuscripts and their need for conservation treatment, which is, after all, one of the reasons why I had studied them in 2004. This slide shows rodent and mold damage. The mold is inactive, but the parchment has weakened and would require reinforcement in the fragile areas. One of the major problems with these graduals is pigment flaking and lifting. These manuscripts were used for centuries. Turning the large folios meant that parts of the parchment would crease, causing the colour to crack and split. The consolidation of the pigments is therefore crucial at this stage. But the problem of most concern is the ink corrosion in one of the volumes, which is still covered in paper. Tests for the removal of this paper to reveal the 16th century miniatures have been carried out and were successful. This treatment could also be done without damaging the 18th century paper, which means we could salvage both the 16th century text and the 18th century text above. Perhaps I am biased about the l'Isle-Adam manuscripts, but I don't think it's the case. I cannot stress further how significant they are to the history of French illuminated manuscripts and how privileged we are to own them. These graduals are to manuscripts what Caravaggio is to painting. Our knowledge on their value and preservation is therefore not to be overlooked. It is hoped that funds would be sought to save this collection sooner rather than later. In this period of social distancing, confinement and uncertainty, it might be appropriate to reflect on the preface of the Eucharistic prayer for the Mass that proclaims Sursum Corda, lift up your hearts. We cannot afford to be drawn by the despair of this pandemic and the gloom of politics. Instead, let us believe that there is hope for us all. Let us look forward to the joy of an embrace, just like Joachim and Anne must have felt when they met at the Golden Gate and Anne had just discovered she was bearing a child. Thank you all for listening.